Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of the ICT's Counter-Terrorism Today special on the coronavirus and its effects on the counterterrorism world, the national security apparatus, and terrorists themselves. Today, we are very honored to be joined all the way from California in the United States by Dr. Erroll Southers. He's a professor of the practice in national and homeland security, the director of the Safe Communities Institute, and the director of homegrown violent extremism studies at the Sol Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. Dr. Southers is also a former FBI special agent who has served in counterterrorism and public safety positions at every level of government. Dr. Southers was President Barack Obama's first nominee for Transportation Security Administration Assistant Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. He has well served for Governor Schwarzenegger as Deputy Director for Critical Infrastructure of the California Office of Homeland Security. Dr. Southers, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, considering that we're all staying at home and safe, but we're doing really well, and I hope you are too.
Yes, we're doing well here at challenging times. We are moving forward and trying to make the best of it, adapting to the world around us. And that's sort of where we come to right now, adapting to the world around us. And let's start there. How has USC, how has California, and the Department of Homeland Security specifically, will focus on where you are in the California region. How have they reacted to the pandemic, especially thinking about California being the fifth largest economy in the world, as well as that there's 40 million people in the state of California, nearly 40 million people, and they also have the majority of goods and services coming into the United States, and agriculture comes from California. How has everything been affected by the pandemic, I guess on a general terms, before we get into specifics?
Certainly. Well, as you already described, we're similar to a small country. And I'm very proud to say that the governor of the state of California implemented executive orders before any other state in the country regarding social distancing. And then, of course, staying at home was implemented in the San Francisco Bay Area as the first city in the country. So the response here was immediate. They didn't wait for anyone to make a decision. Governors have that right, and that's what they did. I can tell you that's what happened on the state level. Of course, counties and cities are going county by county and city by city, and we can talk about that as well because I'm serving on an advisory group to the mayor's office on our reopening and recovery here in Los Angeles. The University of Southern California specifically, we joined our colleagues in universities and colleges across the country in terms of asking students to social distance right away. We are the largest. Our university has the largest number of international students in the United States, so that was awfully challenging as we had students who were already in their home countries, wanting to go to their home countries, stuck here in the United States. So we had to make some decisions, but the campus closed down rather quickly. I'm proud to say we transitioned over 7,000 courses online via Zoom in less than 2 weeks.
Wow.
So you had professors like myself who have taught in the online platform for a long time, where I had a really short learning curve. And then you had some professors who the internet can be the enemy, and they had to go through some training, but it was successful. And we are having our virtual graduation tomorrow, as a matter of fact, for our class of 2020.
Wonderful. Congratulations to them.
Thank you. But believe me, with all that work, and you know what I mean, everybody wants to wear that cap and gown and walk across the stage. So the plan now is to have a real in-person double commencement next year in 2021. We'll have the classes of 2020 and 2021 together.
That's wonderful. I look forward to being able to hear all about that. And as we look and see the adaptions that are being done, as you just made mention, 7,000 courses transferred onto online Zoom. We also have to look at the adaptions that are taking place outside of schools, universities, and businesses, and look at the national security apparatus and how are they adapting to such a dangerous threat to health and security of the nation, and the fact that such a pandemic has been able to bring nations down to their knees and really hold economies at bay. We're seeing massive economies being crushed right now. We're seeing full industries being destroyed. that is a national security issue. Without the proper economy, without the proper funding, you can't fund and defend your nation accordingly. So what do you think has been done correctly or incorrectly in the national security apparatus thus far? How have they adapted to this pandemic?
Well, I'll speak specifically about the national security apparatus. One of the things, as you've mentioned, when you've got people now thinking you're in a first world country, and one of the things that has come out is that we realize how vulnerable we are as a first world country. I mean, in a matter of weeks, we had millions of people file for unemployment, millions of businesses closed, which many of them will not reopen, and a sense of uncertainty that is unprecedented, certainly in our lifetime. On the national security front, I'll just say that fortunately, national security people don't stay at home, and they're working very aggressively. I shared an article with you that I wrote on the virus of hate, because what we wanted to do is make people understand, as it relates to national security and homeland security, we still have the same threats, we still have the same concerns, and with all due respect to COVID-19, we can't have a laser focus on that and forget the greater good of public safety and security. The FBI's New York field office, early on, to our surprise, put out an intelligence analysis briefing that suggested that white supremacists and neo-Nazis were encouraging their members to spread coronavirus to law enforcement and Jewish communities. And with that, they also warned of an increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans. And unfortunately, they were spot on in their analysis and their predictions. So we've seen an uptick in hate crimes, specifically against Asian Americans and Jews. We've been tracking that, as you know, but I can say that obviously crime has plummeted because no one's outside. So crime in Los Angeles, for example, went down I believe 25 to 30%. The unfortunate part about that is I have a number of Los Angeles Police Department officers in my graduate courses. One of them is a captain. He had 11 members under his command who were COVID tested positive.
Wow.
And fortunately, they're fine, but they're in contact with the public every day. So as you talk about public safety and national security, our first responders here have been really challenged, and I've got some firefighters in my courses as well. They've been challenged when they go out to an emergency. Do we go into that home? They have to ask an entire list of questions before they figure out what kind of protective gear they need to perhaps save someone's life. So it's had a great impact on our first responder community. I think it's had an impact on our national security community in regards to extremist organizations leveraging this moment of fear and uncertainty to recruit and perhaps radicalize other people into their beliefs. Because what's also growing, Itai, is this sentiment of anti-government feelings, and we can't trust our government and overreach, and we can talk about that.
And that's sort of let's take the conversation exactly there. So you brought up the extremists that are taking advantage of this situation. And I wanted to exactly ask you about that, because you are in charge of the Center for Homeland Security, or for the Extremist Violent Center there at the USC. So when we look at it, domestic crime, as you mentioned, has gone down in Los Angeles nearly 30%. However, you're seeing an uptick in extremism. What is it about this pandemic? What is it about the environment around us currently that is allowing these extremists to propagate everything that they're trying to do, and to continue to influence and have a greater influence now than they ever did before, in essence?
Well, that's a great question. Let's talk about the notion of accelerationists. And that's a movement that's been brought on by some radical right organizations and people, that because by the year 2045, it's projected that the United States will become a minority-majority country. They believe that because of that, we're sort of spiraling down this rabbit hole to a place where America doesn't want to be financially, fiscally, in terms of demographics. So they've decided we need to accelerate that action to prove we're correct. We need to accelerate our actions to make sure it doesn't happen. So whereas for some time these organizations took up a defensive posture, they're now taking a more offensive posture with regards to making their almost facilitating an environment of fear and anticipation amongst those religious and ethnic minorities in the United States. So if you're afraid to go to the grocery store because somebody's going to do something to you or say something to you, eventually you start harboring fears of whether you should live here or not. And that's been the notion, is that we can drive people out of this country and slow this pace of becoming a minority majority in the future. They're leveraging fear, and as we all know, terrorism is based on fear, and this is working very well for them because the response from our federal government has been really confusing. It's been disconnected from our state governments in place. They've been at odds with each other. So that continues to fuel the argument by extremist organizations that our government can't take care of us. They can't protect you. And that's been really the driving force with regards to them getting some traction with the things they've been saying for the better part of 5 to 10 years.
And I'm very curious. It might be slightly off topic on our discussion here, but it just brings up a whole world of questions that I have when you say what you just did. It's very, very interesting and enlightening. And I wanted to ask you about these, I guess, anti-government sentiments that are arising right now. How many of, in your opinion, of the people that are joining these anti-government organizations, or even just speaking about anti-government sentiments and feelings, do you believe really go by the letter of the law when it comes to the Constitution? And they're looking at, the Second Amendment, where it really, the reason the Second Amendment is there is for anti-government sentiment, to be able to have yourself an armed militia to withstand government oppression. How much of that is going into play now in what I would classify a brainwashing of extremism to bring them into anti-government sentiment camps?
Well, Etai, you've hit the nail on the head. And to be honest with you, that whole Second Amendment conversation, for the people who really understand the Second Amendment, it gets stretched quite a bit with regards to rights and responsibilities. And that's certainly a whole other conversation. But I will say this, you've got two different movements going. First of all, because people didn't want to be at home, they had to stay at home. They couldn't go to work. We've seen a number of, quote, stay-at-home protests in capitals of states across the country. What has happened, to your point, is those militias and some patriot movements have come to those collective gatherings armed to push their agenda. Again, the government, look what the government's doing to you. They've now taken your job. They've taken away your ability to take care of your family. They're telling you can't go outside, and it's starting to add up. I'll give you some, and on top of that, to make matters demonstrably worse, we've had this movement for some time now that's gone underground, and now it's totally out in the open, called the Boogaloo. And the Boogaloo is a term used by the far right for this wishful second civil war. The whole reason for the spiraling of our country down the rabbit hole will eventually turn out to be a civil war, and they're going to be prepared for it. So that's why they're armed and they're training. By the way, these Boogaloo members call themselves Boujadines. And the other thing that they do is, we've seen a couple of different descriptions of, if they're online, sometimes you'll see them, they'll refer to this as the big igloo. So if you see igloos in any of the images you're getting from the United States, that's part of the Boogaloo movement. They've also transposed it into something called the big luau, as in a Hawaiian luau. Mm-hmm. And they'll show up at these gatherings fully armed, like they're going to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, with Hawaiian shirts on. So they're easily identifiable. But let me give you some numbers. They're on Facebook, they're on Twitter, just like we are. In the last month, 125 Facebook groups boasting more than 72,000 members of the Boogaloo were online. Wow. What's really interesting about that is, between January and April, those groups appeared in an increase of 60%. They attracted over 36,000 members in 1 month. Wow. The reason that this is a concern, and again, you always ask great questions. The reason this is a concern, you're on Facebook, you're promoting this. Let's just say you've got the First Amendment, free speech. However, they're now crowdsourcing tips online about homemade explosives. They're uploading CIA handbooks. military manuals, but the bomb assembly manual, which you may remember a long time ago, the Anarchist Cookbook, has come back.
Mm-hmm.
What's particularly interesting and out in the public domain is that we've identified a planning document that identified locations of National Guard depots, police stations, and factories that produce munitions described as, quote, very solid targets for this group.
Wow.
So that's a particular concern to us. And then we can talk about people that have been arrested since the whole COVID-19 stay-at-home orders have gone in place, who are actually going out to target either hospitals or other places with explosives and were arrested by the FBI. We've had two of those.
You said so in Kansas City.
Yeah, we had one in Kansas City. He was going to blow up a hospital where they were treating COVID patients, and he got caught and he got killed in the arrest that took place that day by the FBI. And we had another arrest here recently of an individual who had several pipe bombs and explosives in his home. He was going to the protests in Denver, Colorado. He was promoting online that people should come armed and that they should be out there ready to take on the government. He got arrested about a week or two ago as well. And the search warrant yielded quite a bit of information and materials in his home as well.
It's very interesting and enlightening, and it brings up the question and a debate that has been, I believe, simmering in the United States for at least the last 6-7 years, and that is domestic terrorism, domestic extremism, a bigger threat than foreign terrorism within the United States? And I know that that's a debate that you have with colleagues and your peers all over. I have debated this with several people quite often as well, and it's also a matter of allocating resources, because if you're allocating all your resources to foreign terrorism, well, you're not defending versus domestic terrorism. And now you need to sort of find a balancing act, especially with the rise of these boogaloo groups and groups like them that are threatening national security on a domestic level and using United States laws, using the United States Code and Bill of Rights to their advantage. What is a bigger threat, and how do you allocate resources to balance both the threats?
Well, again, your questions are always right on point. So I don't have to debate my colleagues that much anymore. They're finally starting to pay attention to the data, which, as you and I have discussed in the last decade, between 75 and 80% of the domestic attacks here have been perpetrated by extreme radical right people. The Department of Homeland Security this past year put out a document to that effect. However, again, terminology is always really interesting and politicized. They're not calling it domestic terrorism. They're calling it targeted violence. So again, no one wants to be called the T word because it's such a pejorative term. So now we're dealing with, quote, targeted violence, which of course has its origin in either racial extremists or religious extremists or issue-oriented extremists like the anti-government folks. We'll have to wait and see what that really means, because since the Department of Homeland Security produced that document, I haven't seen any actions to suggest that they're going to move that direction. The FBI has never stopped focusing on that, but at least now they're on board as well, officially. We'll see whether or not we get funding to that effect. I do know that there's been a grant opportunity that's out there for targeted violence, so it looks like the pendulum's starting to swing. However, those states that have these kinds of things happen, we need to start prosecuting people for that. And I know you've probably heard some discussion in the United States about new domestic terrorism laws. And Itai, we don't need a new law. We have 52 statutes under United States Code Title 18 that we can use to charge someone with domestic terrorism, and we choose not to. We charge them with, of course, murder. We charge them with hate crimes because they targeted a protected group, but we never seem to get over that threshold of calling them domestic terrorists. I mean, as you and I have discussed, Timothy McVeigh in 1995 was not prosecuted for a domestic terrorist act. When he killed 168 people, he was prosecuted for using a weapon of mass destruction against a federal building. Dylan Roof, when he killed 9 people in South Carolina, even though the Attorney General went out and had a press conference and said, and I'll never forget her words, he has basically taken care of or enacted all of the characteristics we would need for a domestic terrorist, so we're charging him with a hate crime. And that's what they did. Now, with all due respect, you can still go to prison for life for a hate crime, but we will waste no time in charging our international terrorists like the Tsarnaev brothers in Boston with terrorism, whereas we won't charge others with terrorism because they're homegrown.
Why do you think that is? What is the reasoning behind that? Is it to avoid fear within the public that there are terrorists among them? Is it about race? Is it about culture? What is it exactly about the fear of labeling someone like Dylan Roof specifically a terrorist? I understand that you should also charge him as a hate crime. I don't disagree with that. I think that's the leeway of a district attorney, attorney generals, U.S. attorneys, the ability to have multiple charges on an individual. And so I don't know why it would be out of line to say there's a hate crime here and a terrorist crime here and charge them with both. You use terrorist tactics to instill fear in the population. You targeted a specific group because of racial hate, and that's a hate crime as well as a terrorist crime. So why is there such a avoidance, if you will, to label and charge under domestic terrorism?
Well, excuse me, perhaps that's why you and I are not lawyers. I would charge him with everything. I agree. Absolutely agree. I charge him with everything. Unfortunately, terrorism never seems to reach the table. Again, great question, because you've hit on which aspects of this are the problem. Is it politics? Is it race? Is it culture? It's all of the above. I think first, to your point, politically, we in America are, I hate to say this, still in a period or space of denial that Americans can kill Americans for extremist or radicalized views. We want to believe that somebody else does that, or someone else comes here and does that, or they're from another country. We don't do that to each other. Well, as you and I both know, we do with great regularity. I do think it's about race. And I'll say this, ethnic and religious minorities, you'll see that terrorism term come up much more quickly when we have an incident in the United States than not. In fact, I can almost tell by listening to the news report without looking at television, if they say we've had some atrocity and they describe the suspect without using the term terrorism, I could automatically assume there's a 95% chance he's going to be a male white, as opposed to a male of some ethnic or religious minority, because I know. Culture, again, one of us just believing that we're better than everybody else in every respect. And because we have this high ethical and moral standard in America, we would never do that to each other. And nothing could be further from the truth. This is human behavior. And human behavior knows no geographic boundaries. And we are starting to come to grips with the fact that, yes, we do. It's not a character flaw. It's just something that human beings do. Unfortunately, our court systems and our prosecutorial judiciary don't seem to follow those rules. And there seems to be two sets of rules when it comes to depending on who the perpetrator is.
And I think it's very interesting, in that we could have an entire podcast, an entire series just on that specifically. So I don't want to delve too far into that, because I do have another question that I wanted to bring up, and you brought it up as well earlier, as there's a disconnect from federal government to state level, all the way down to even city, municipal levels. I think one of the questions that has to be asked, and I think you're exactly the person to ask it, comes out in a specific op-ed that was written in the Washington Post by Beth Cameron. She's the former senior director for the Global Health Security and Biodefense at the National Security Council in the White House. It was set up by President Obama back in 2014 to deal with the Ebola outbreak, and really to help prevent anything coming to the United States, but also on a global level because of the reliance the United States and the rest of the Western world has on a global economy. If one domino falls, you don't want to see the rest fall and thus destroy your economy, even if you're not hit by the Ebola virus. We have many different reports, and so it's confusing, and hence why I wanted to ask you about President Trump disbanding that organization. Another person comes out and says, no, not disbanded. We just aligned everything. We realigned everyone. But I will take the word of the former director of the organization, who was very pleased to say that when President Trump took office in 2017, he kept the group together. However, a year later, she was quite surprised in 2018 when he disbanded the group. What is your opinion, first of all, if that group was officially disbanded? And if that group was disbanded, which I believe it is, that's my personal take, how much of an effect did that have on the spread of this virus into the United States? And what type of culpability does the White House now have in understanding the fact that, A, they disbanded this organization, this unit that was working with every level of the United States government, every agency, to protect the United States from a pandemic that has been predicted for over a few years will come, not necessarily this specific virus, but a pandemic will eventually make its way over. How much culpability is there, and what should the American people feel towards their government, towards the White House, when that news comes out, especially in an op-ed by the former director?
Well, first of all, I'm certainly not going to challenge an op-ed by the former director. So I'll just say it this way. If she has described the group as being disbanded, I think there's our answer. As we both know, anything that has former President Obama's fingerprints on it gets removed, whether it's Obamacare, whether it's the pandemic group or infrastructure that's in place, whether it's environmental protections, whether it's workers' protections. Over the last 3.5 years, we have seen a slow erosion of anything that came out of the last 8 years when President Obama was president be removed by this president. Second, what's quite interesting, your question about responsibility, we had the early days of COVID-19 where the administration in their briefings would say, we're in charge, we're taking the lead, we've got a pandemic task force set up. And then less than a week into that, the president saying, I will take no responsibility for this. So again, that mixed message is what's caused governors in the states and mayors in their cities to decide we can't depend on them. We need to move. What's really even more challenging about that is setting it up so governors from states are competing on an open market with each other for personal protective equipment and respirators. So again, we're on their own. There's a hearing going on right now in Congress with Dr. Bright, who was in charge of a unit who told the administration in January, we're in trouble. We are in trouble. This is coming. It's here. And no one would pay attention to him. So he's now a whistleblower who, by the way, was removed from his position by the administration because he said, no one was taking me seriously enough. And now he's out there talking about how the window of opportunity was closing. As it relates to responsibility and liability, that remains to be seen. You and I are both waiting. I'm waiting for the first, I'm going to say, class action lawsuit against the United States government. With all the people that have died, victims who died who were people like you and me, victims who have been doctors, victims who have been police officers and firefighters. I'm waiting for the first class action suit to go against this government. Look, we had to have responders to 9/11 who died, a lot of firefighters and police officers. They finally had to sue because they got nothing after that all happened. I'm anticipating that will probably happen again. I don't know what degree of culpability the government has because they're trying to distance themselves from this now, still maintaining a position of you're on your own. They have minimized the role of the Center for Disease Control for CDC. They have totally walked away from the World Health Organization. And as you know, there was a meeting 2 weeks ago of all the leaders of most industrialized countries, and we were not at the table. So this is going to be very interesting because, again, most of the actions taking place here with regards to minimizing this threat, they're even questioning the fatality rate now, is because we have an election in November. Mm-hmm. And we have a president that wants to be reelected and does not want to have to deal with this as an election, or let's just say an administration failure.
Well, I'm not here to judge one way or the other. That's for the voters of the United States to judge. I can give an opinion that I feel that there was some sort of failure on the government of the United States, the strongest nation in the world, the most advanced country in the entire world. I feel should have had some more preparation and ability to prevent this from spreading throughout its 50 states. I think it's quite interesting to see how, in my opinion, extreme disconnect, not just between the federal government and the states, but also the states. You brought it up now. States are competing with one another on the open market for PPE, personal protective equipment. However, I'm also seeing they're competing with one another on who can reopen the quickest, on who is going to be the fastest economy to come back. I saw the governor of Florida offer to any sports league and any sports team, you can have the state of Florida is up here open to you for business. Nevada considering opening up for business, again, also to all the sports leagues to go in there. And the question is now, if there's such a disconnect between the federal government, the state government, municipal government, what are the people supposed to actually believe, feel, think? Because this is how fear-mongering really begins. And you can see that maybe Florida will say open up. Nebraska will say stay closed. The federal government will say do what you want. And then how do you actually know what's going on? And especially when people can travel from state to state, there's no border restriction. South Carolina's closed, but Georgia's open. So by all means, go over. We've even seen a woman get really upset because her salon was not allowed to be opened in South Carolina, but in Georgia across the border, they're open and all her clientele were going there. This is now becoming a competition between states on who can reopen the quickest. That is also putting the health system and national security in peril as well, correct?
So you're right on point. Let me tell you why that competition exists. First of all, to the letter, if you'll see those states that are jumping to reopen are largely states with Republican governors. Now, you reopen, you've obviously had that conversation with the White House. All those dollars that you're hoping to get to support you will go to you. It's already been stated by this administration that they're going to be slow to fund governors who don't really bow down to them. That means a state like California. So we've politicized the healthcare of our country to the top degree. And that's what's happening here now, is you're seeing these states, what brings in more revenue than team sports, professionalized sports. So the first thing you do is anybody who wants to play soccer or football or basketball, come to my state. This is all about money. This is all about jobs. I hate to say it this way, excuse my French, the health of our people be damned. We're going to get reopened. We're going to restart our economy. And as they've been saying for the last month, people die. Well, that's a really nice position to take as long as they're not your friends or relatives. And I can tell you this, in those states that have reopened, both Florida and Georgia, which I have relatives in both, and my brother owns a business in Atlanta, they're not reopening their business. They're continuing to self-distance. They're continuing to wear masks. They're continuing to watch the numbers that they're seeing that are being publicized about people who are infected and people who are dying. And they're going to slowly roll back into this. I can tell you now, the state of California, we are still under stay at home. And yesterday, the mayor of Los Angeles decided you now have to wear a mask when you walk out of your house. So I just came back from walking my dog with a mask on. Now, I don't think I have to do that because nobody's around me, or if you're on a bicycle, but people are doing it. But if you do walk into a business, you have to wear it. And people are doing it. However, there's no enforcement here. So for those people who suggest it's government overreach, if you want to go out without a mask, go for it. If you want to go into a business without a mask, they have the right to ask you to leave. And so I'm challenging the government overreach. No one's rights have been curtailed. The store has a right to refuse service to anybody. If their reason today is you don't have a mask, then you're out of luck.
No, it makes perfect sense. I appreciate the answer there. And just to double back there, because I was a little curious and wanting to know how much of that affects fear mongering. Because one thing that I have seen here in Israel specifically is, while we're not getting too much mixed messaging, I have to give the government credit here for its messaging and the way it's been reporting and its transparency to the public. We are seeing, though, that there are still some mixed messages via the internet, via fear mongering, if it's on social media or just in groups of people talking and chatting. But as an example, I was walking my dog the other day, and they're reopening some schools across the country here in Israel. Certain grades can go back, certain days of the week, etc., as they are trying to figure it out. And two young boys, 10, 11, 12 years old, something in that range, were on the street just talking to one another, social distancing, and got to respect the way they were doing it as well. And the one boy said, "I'm excited to go back to school on Sunday. I'll see you there." And he goes, "Well, school's open, but my dad's not letting me go back to school." So he's not going back to school. The other one is, and this brings up a whole new set of questions, is the question of the fear mongering. How are people going to get over this fear? Where's the resiliency supposed to come into play if the government isn't giving the correct messaging?
You know, the fear mongering is huge. And I'll say this, what I've been telling people lately, I don't listen to anybody who doesn't have MD behind their name. And I said, that's my first starting point. The challenge we have here now, Itai, is that you've got doctors who are disagreeing with each other, and that's what happens. I mean, scientific trials take time, and with all due respect, a vaccine in a perfect environment usually takes about 10 years to develop. So everything we're hearing now about an 18-month timeline for a vaccine is extremely optimistic. You know, I have a saying, you know, don't confuse your Google search with my MD, right? Schools are a problem because, as we talked about earlier, with unemployment and layoffs, how do people go back to work if their kids are home?
That's what I've said.
So the reason for schools is strategic. If we can get kids back in school, we can get parents back to work. So see, there's an agenda here. Our K through 12 schools are now talking about reopening. And no one knows what that's going to look like. I'm sitting in a city with the second largest school district in America. Does that mean these kids, first of all, let's start out with the beginning of the day. Do they ride the bus together like they used to?
Right.
There's no social distancing there. Are we going to cut the classes in half? If we do, is school going to go for 12 to 14 hours a day? Who's going to teach those classes? Are we going to socially distance in the classroom? Are they not going to eat together, play together? So there's the logistics for this are huge. It's much easier to open a store than it is to open a school.
Right.
But the cascading effect here, you know, it's sort of like when we had the earthquake that caused a tsunami that caused, you know, the nuclear power issue.
Yeah.
The cascading effects here are huge. We can't talk about revitalizing an economy if we don't get kids back in school. And I think that's the reason you're hearing that discussion and the reason it's happening. And by the way, those two Israeli boys are not unlike kids here in America. I can't wait to see if and when schools open, who returns. I think that goes for colleges and universities too. My daughter's already said she's kind of had it with online learning for a semester. And she says, Dad, if they're not going to go back in the fall, I'm going to go ahead and enroll in a different school to community college for a semester, and then I'll go back. She says, but I'm not going to do another semester online because it's not giving me what I need in terms of my education. So good discussion.
That's a fair point.
You're right. But back to your original point, it's the fear brought on by the misinformation. You can go online and find people who will tell you this is total nonsense in terms of COVID, and people who will tell you that you should never go out of your house for the rest of the year. Both in the medical community.
The extremes on either end never fail, in no matter what the subject matter may be. Before we let you go, Dr. Southers, I've taken a lot of your time out of your day today. I know it's still early in Southern California, so you have a big day ahead of you still. But I wanted to ask you, before we let you go here, what do you think is, I guess, the lessons that are to be learned from this when applying them to national security moving forward? We touched on the fact that the federal government dissolved the pandemic team and thus leaving the United States a little more exposed than it needed to be. We've seen the response by the federal government and state governments and what might need to be learned in the future, because this is not a one-off. And while it may be a one-off in the sense of the way it came about, the fact that a pandemic happened is not a shock to anyone that has done any research in the past about this. And moving forward, we know that another pandemic will happen, an outbreak will happen. And now that terrorist organizations, extremist groups, states that have a real interest to disrupt the world economy or whatnot might look at biomedical weaponry and sit there and say, well, this is the way to really get everyone down to their knees, because we can spread the flu, for example, across one country into another continent and shut down the global economy that way. Get what we want out of the world leaders by doing that. That is a distinct possibility. So what are some of the lessons learned from this pandemic now in the COVID-19 era that we should take moving forward and apply them on a national security level to prevent a terrorist from using a weapon like this, a homegrown extremist, or a state using a biomedical weapon against the United States or the Western world?
Well, great question. And to the article that I sent you, that I wrote in April, this is a classroom learning environment for our adversary. They're learning exactly what governments will do, won't do, can't do, and vulnerabilities that they're just sitting there right now soaking all of this up, because you're right. If I'm going to strategize for the future, this is the Achilles heel. So I'll say one thing. It's obviously not at the top of that list of things we can do and must do later. This is a leadership moment. This is a leadership moment. And no matter what country you're in, that can set second to nothing. It's a leadership moment. I can't say it enough times. There has to be a clear, consistent message coming from one voice. One of the reasons the governors in the United States have done so well, especially Governor Cuomo in New York, Governor Newsom in California, they have had daily briefings every single day with a clear, consistent message about what is happening. Most importantly, those conversations they're having every day are driven by data. And so, as I always say, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. They are sounding like doctors, and they have doctors sitting next to them every single day. Governor Cuomo, Governor Newsom, and in the afternoon in Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti. So clear, consistent messaging is critical, along with data. And most importantly, Itai, at the end of that list is a plan. What is the plan? What is the plan today? What is the plan going forward? At what threshold do we have to cross to get that plan operationalized? Having that conversation every single day doesn't leave me wondering, geez, what the heck is going on? Every morning I watch Governor Cuomo, and every afternoon I watch Mayor Garcetti, and I learn something every day. So the four things I would say: leadership, messaging, data, and a plan that's articulated to the public every day.
I think that's very important. It's enlightening and a sobering conversation. Dr. Southers, I really appreciate you taking the time. For any of our viewers that came in the middle or in between the conversation, Dr. Erroll Southers is a professor of practice in national and Homeland Security, director of the Safe Communities Institute, and director of Homegrown Violent Extremism Studies at the Sol Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California, and a former special agent of the FBI serving in counterterrorism and public safety positions at every level of government. Dr. Southers, thank you so much for taking the time out of your extremely busy schedule to join us here in Herzliya, Israel over Zoom for a very enlightening and sobering conversation about national security in the COVID era.
Well, Itai, toda rabah, and my regards to everyone there. And I may not see you as anticipated in 2 months as I normally do, but do stay safe, stay vigilant, and stay connected.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. And I hope you and your family stay safe and healthy, and everyone else around you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure.